Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Kyobin Huang. I'm a medical student at the University of Toronto. And alongside Dr. Chan from Women's College Hospital, we conducted a systematic review examining journal policies for clinical trial registration, adherence to reporting guidelines, as well as public data sharing. So I'm going to start by providing some background context. I think it goes without saying that the transparent reporting of clinical trials is truly a cornerstone of evidence-based medicine. It's so important, but there are still cases of selective outcome reporting, incomplete disclosure of methods, as well as restricted data access, which are all conditions that can lead to avoidable bias, research waste, and even patient harm down the line. And so this begs the question of what can we do? What can be done on an institutional level, on an editorial level? And so that brings us to the policies that you see on this slide here. For example, by mandating trial registration, we can reduce the risk of selective outcome reporting. By warranting and mandating adherence to reporting guidelines like Consort and Spirit, we can promote the inclusion of key methodological and result details in publication. Lastly, by requiring public data sharing, we can promote reproducibility and secondary analyses, which are important to facilitate broader scientific collaboration. And so all this points to why these policies are so critical. Now, prior research has been conducted that examine the prevalence of these policies in the context of specific medical specialties. And that's what you see on this slide here. These are examples of this study. But the extent to which these policies are adopted across the full spectrum of medical journals still remains unknown. And without this broad cross-disciplinary understanding of journal policies, there's limited insight into how widespread these best practices are and whether certain disciplines lag behind in adopting these essential guidelines. So that effectively brings us to the objective of our study, which was to examine the prevalence of these transparency promoting guidelines and also to see whether certain journal characteristics like impact factor, publishing model, as well as journal scope have a association with requiring these policies. By expanding the scope of our inquiry to include various types of journals rather than limiting it to a particular specialty, we aim to provide a comprehensive assessment of the current state of medical publishing and also to identify areas for future involvement or improvement. And so this slide here overviews our methodology. We started off by conducting a PubMed search for articles indexed as clinical trials. We included journals that published equal to or greater than 20 trials in 2023. And based on this inclusion criteria, we had 380 journals included for further analysis. The QR code on the top right will take you to a list of a comprehensive list of included journals. And so these journals underwent data extraction. Data extraction involved the researchers going into the individual journal websites, looking at sections like the instruction for authors page, as well as the editorial policy pages of these websites to glean the relevant information. After data extraction, we proceeded to the statistical analysis phase, which involved firstly a descriptive analysis to summarize the prevalence of the various journal types, and secondly, a multivariable logistic regression to see the association between various journal characteristics as well as policy requirements. All data extraction was conducted in duplicate, and this slide here summarizes the different fields that we were interested in extracting. So on the left here, you can see the journal characteristics that we were interested in. So we pulled information on the number of trials a particular journal published in 2023, as well as whether the journal is classified as being a general or a specialty medical journal. We were also interested in the language of the journal, in addition to the open access model, so whether it was purely open access or other. And we are also interested in the impact factor as well. On the right side of the slide, you can see the different policy types that we were interested in. We were interested in the requirements surrounding trial registration, as well as adherence to reporting guidelines like Consort and Spirit. We were also interested in mandates surrounding trial protocol submission, whether that be as a supplemental material or for peer review. Lastly, we were interested in requirements surrounding public data sharing. Now, this was twofold. We were interested in whether journals required the public availability of participant level data sets, as well as whether the journals required the disclosure of a data sharing plan. All of these policies were either classified as being required or recommended. We classified a policy as being required if the journals used words such as must, need, or should to describe a certain policy, and a policy was classified as being recommended if more conditional terms were used. For example, trial registration is encouraged, then we would say that it was a recommended policy. Two additional classifications were unclear and not mentioned for those instances as well. This brings us to the results section. So we have journal characteristics here. I want to start by drawing your attention to the visual on the left. And you can see that over 90% of journals were specialty journals, the most common being oncology journals, followed by psychiatry, then pharmacology. Now, focusing on the visual on the right, you can see that 20% of included journals were purely open access journals, examples including BMC, JAMA Publications, as well as Frontiers. Other notable journal characteristics that we looked at were the number of trials published in 2023, which presented with a median value of 31 trials. The mean impact factor of included journals was 9.1. Journals of all languages were included, but 98% of journals were English-based. So next we have journal policy prevalence. So I want to start by giving you a bearing on this visual here. The blue bar represents the proportion of journals that required a certain policy. The orange represents the percentage of journals that recommended a said policy, and the gray bar represents the percentage of journals that either did not mention a certain policy or was unclear. And so you can see from this graph that the most prevalent journal policy that was required was trial registration, with over 80% of journals requiring this particular policy. Adherence to reporting guideline was also quite prevalent, with around 2/3 of journals requiring this. Now, the remaining three policies were a lot less prevalent. Specifically, trial protocol submission was only required by less than a third of journals. In fact, 40% of these journals had no mention at all when it came to protocol submission. When it came to the public availability of participant level data sets, we had over half of the journals recommend this particular policy or recommend this practice. But it's important to note here that this was merely framed as a recommendation, not a requirement. Lastly, we had disclosure of data sharing plan, and this was required by just over half of the journals as well. So as I mentioned earlier, we conducted a multivariable logistic regression to assess the association between various journal characteristics and policy requirements. What we found was that open access journals were more likely to recommend and require certain policies, namely trial registration, reporting guidelines adherence, protocol submission, and public data sharing. And you can see from this table here that the odds ratio ranged from 2.5 to 4.8. In terms of impact factor, we found that higher impact factors were associated and more likely to recommend certain policies. For example, we saw a 2.7-fold increase in requiring trial registration and a 2.1-fold increase in requiring reporting guidelines with increased impact factor. We also conducted analysis surrounding the volume of trials published in a year as well as journal scope, but we found no significant associations there. So the findings of our studies highlight the fact that there is considerable variation when it comes to the adoption of transparency promoting guidelines across medical journals. There are significant gaps that exist, particularly when it comes to trial protocol submission requirements, as well as public data sharing. This is very concerning because protocols are important for us to verify whether research was conducted as planned, and public data sharing can allow others to reproduce findings, and it can allow others to build on these scientific endeavors. And so the downstream effects of this can be selective outcome reporting, omission of key details in the publication, as well as poor reproducibility. This begs the question next of what can we do, or so the call to action. I think the main takeaway from my talk today is that there is a need for improved editorial standards across medical journals. Journals need to develop and implement policies particularly focused on trial registration, reporting guidelines, as well as public data sharing. In addition to having these policies in place, It's also important to engage in the process of enforcement, particularly during the peer review process. By promoting this culture of accountability, we can ensure that scientific contributors are upheld to these standards. These may seem like modest editorial adjustments, but they can go a significant way in promoting further transparency and ultimately reducing research waste within the scientific community. Thank you so much for your engagement, and I'll be happy to field questions.
Thank you, Kerben. Do we have any questions? I think we have someone.
Chris Winchester from Oxford Pharmacogenesis. I was struck by only 80-something% of journals requiring prospective trial registration. Can you comment on that at all? And ICMJ recommendations, etc.
Sorry, do you mind repeating
Shall I repeat that?
the end of that question, please?
Oh, well, just because the ICMJ does require trial registration. So were any of those journals non-ICMJ, or were any of them ICMJ journal?
Yes, thank you for the question. Definitely a large proportion of the included journals were part of ICMJ, but there was a very small proportion, and that definitely correlated to why we're not seeing 100% of trial registration here, because those that did not require trial registration accounted for the small proportion of journals that were not part of ICMJ.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We've got another question coming here.
Robert Tebow, Coalition for Atlantic Science. I'm wondering if you looked at all at preprint repositories and if they had any of these recommendations or requirements. Well, just there's so many journals, but there's many fewer preprint repositories that if people are preprint regularly, maybe the preprints are a way, well, they can't require, they're not checking that much, but they could at least recommend.
Right. Thank you so much for the question. Our main source of data came from the journal web pages because we found that that was the main or first point of contact for authors when they're looking at journal policies and what the requirements are. We didn't dig deep into the repositories, data repositories. That's not something that we looked at, but definitely interesting future direction as well that may shed meaningful, valuable insights. Thank you.
Have another question?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, one of the issues is that authors don't always read recommendation to author, right? So do you think policy is enough, or whether they should have more active implementation of this policy?
Sorry, do you mind saying the question one last time? I'm so sorry.
So one of the issues, when you look at the recommendations to author, that a lot of authors don't read the recommendation to authors,
Yeah.
but they're very long and
Yes.
not going to look everything. So do you think editors should also be more active in their request to fulfill this requirement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that I mentioned this earlier, but there is this disjunction, almost gap between having policies in place and actually enforcing it. And so journals think they may be doing enough by having an established policies, but are they actually following through and ensuring that scientific contributors are following through and adhering to these policies? So I think that's definitely a question on its own. But we need to, I think, to answer your question, identify barriers that may be preventing authors from actually being able to follow through with these policies, and journals have a responsibility to work towards dissolving those barriers, whether that be bureaucratic barriers, administrative barriers that may prevent authors from upholding and following through with adhering to these journal policies.
So I assume we're just understanding the journal policies from their policy pages, right? So
Right.
you didn't have a sense of whether they actually did have checklists and
Yeah, so that is one of the limitations of the study, actually. We only retrieved information from the journal pages. So we don't know if there's any unpublished requirements or unpublished policies that we may have overlooked. Also, along that line, because we extracted data at one point in time, there may have been updates to the policies since then because this is a dynamic process. And so we haven't been able to account for that either. But yeah, that is a limitation, the fact that our main source of data came from the journal web pages.